The Eyes of Texas used to be a popular folk tune, but today the song could be about other eyes, the eyes of a spy machine. We live in the United States of surveillance, with cameras like these increasingly positioned on street corners and with much more invisible spying online and on the phone. Anyone who's paying attention knows that privacy could be out the window. That's what former newspaper editor Bill Kovach says.
I think the idea of privacy is gone. I think you have to adjust to the fact that somebody somewhere may be watching what you're doing, and it may not be the government. It may be General Motors. It may be General Telephone and Telegraph. It may be the drugstore on the corner.
All of this is not happening by accident. Well-funded, powerful agencies and companies are engaged in the business of keeping tabs on what we do, what we say, and what we think. Mass surveillance is the focus of this new 6-part investigative documentary series, examining who is watching whom and why. Some Americans are up in arms, including an internet entrepreneur who says government spying could be a first step towards a police state, Alfredo Lopez.
Let me put it this way. There is in the United States all the technology, from drones to computers to surveillance to day-to-day camera surveillance all over the country. There is a structure and apparatus for a police state. The United States is not a police state. That is clear. We are not that. There I draw the line. But we can be. And we can be with a flip of a switch. And the real problem is, I'm not sure that the people of this country have not become sufficiently unconscious of their rights and of the Constitution and the purpose of the Constitution to really put a halt to that when it starts. And so, that's the real battle.
Others believe spying is now a big industry, more about money allocated out of fear than stopping terrorism. Sam Antar is a convicted felon who says there's a corporate angle.
It's a bigger story than the NSA story. It's really corporate surveillance of critics or corporate surveillance of rivals within their own corporations. In other words, executives surveilling rival executives.
These companies are looking for the Edward Snowdens in their own world.
Yes.
To many in the world today, the face of America has a big nose for sniffing and sifting mountains of data, phone calls, emails, and texts, and with many mouths silenced by paranoia to keep what they decide is secret, secret. Even high-tech sector executives are deeply troubled.
I'm incredibly disappointed. Truthfully, I had become disappointed over the last couple of years. I strongly had suspected this, like many others, that this was happening. But what I had not realized is that actually now we've created a situation where all commerce is unsafe, all communications are unsafe. The most things that we had expected to be actually have some level of protection, completely eviscerated.
Just like Toys R Us is one of our biggest stores for kids, Secrets R Us has become an American obsession and now an explosive and divisive issue that affects people all over the world.
It's important that the U.S. is embarrassed by this because there isn't a way around it. They should stop it. They should stop indeceit. They should sign a treaty saying they will not conduct cyber war. They should sign a treaty saying they will respect the human rights of the whole world.
Taken together, America has become a surveillance industrial state where everyone's business has become its business and where one huge U.S. intelligence agency has been given the sanction and unlimited amounts of money to spy on the whole world. In this series, you'll meet a former undercover FBI agent who says government spying is out of control.
We want the intelligence agencies and the law enforcement agencies to have power to go after people who are doing harm. But these programs are being done regardless of any suspicion of wrongdoing.
And and a computer whiz who did the same kind of specialized secret work that whistleblower Edward Snowden did, but for the military.
Well, I mean, when you work for the government, you're like, hey, I'm here to do a job. You know, and at the end of the day, go home and make sure the job's gotten done right. And it's really that simple. And the federal government has a lot of really outstanding people that work for it. I mean, high-end, high level. They wake up dedicated to make sure that it's done to the highest level you can imagine. But sometimes you just have people that just do their thing. You know, they become upset with what they see.
You will also hear from Edward Snowden's personal lawyer, who says that his leaks to the public were leaks of conscience.
You know, Edward Snowden has no desire to harm his country in any way. He believes that he's still on the side of his former colleagues, but they just don't see that. We've tilted too far in the direction of collecting information on innocent people.
At the same time, writer Andy Greenberg of Wired magazine says Snowden's revelations are leading to reform.
It seems that he's their worst nightmare, a kind of genius employee gone rogue. What I do see that's kind of remarkable is that his leaks are already starting to inspire reforms. Even as the government, the Department of Justice, calls for his imprisonment, the president himself is talking about how the NSA needs to be reformed based on what he's released.
Going forward, I'm directing the Director of National Intelligence, in consultation with the Attorney General, to annually review, for the purposes of declassification, any future opinions of the court with broad privacy implications, and to report to me and to Congress on these efforts.
Stopping mass surveillance is also an issue that is building in intensity.
I cannot stand this anymore. I can't. As a mother, as a daughter, I cannot try to explain this situation to my children.
This is an effort that's uniting strange bedfellows from across the political spectrum. I'm proud to sound here with Democrats, with Republicans, with progressives, with libertarians, because this is not about right and left. This is about right and wrong.
In this series, we'll tell you what NSA really does, how it works with telecom and internet companies, and the threat it poses to a free press and democratic values.
It's not only a violation of freedom of the press, it's a violation of the public's right to know. Information is the oxygen of a democracy. It's not just about participating in democratic processes. It's about being informed. That's what makes democracy meaningful. And when we don't have that information, when a very powerful entity, the government, has the information and the people don't, that is not a very healthy sign.
We will also show you how whistleblowers, hackers, and activists are fighting back and winning support worldwide.
There's been a kind of cat and mouse game between the surveillers and the surveilled that's been going on for decades. And what WikiLeaks, I think, was the first to show is that the mice can have some small or even large victories despite their lack of resources. Now, we see that the cats have cracked down again and that the surveillance state has responded. But then Snowden, appeared as another win for the mice. So, I think that this is going to continue, these sort of, a kind of tit for tat. But it does seem that these revelations by the mice, these moments when we learn, when transparency wins out over secrecy, essentially, are getting bigger over time.
Even as protests mount, the United States government still supports a vast cyber spying program.
What I've been very clear about is that there has to be a narrow purpose to it, not a broad-based purpose, but it's rather based on a specific concern around terrorism or counterproliferation or human trafficking or something that I think all of us would say has to be pursued.
President Obama has called for some minor reforms, but critics are not satisfied.
There's some things that I actually like about Barack Obama, but I'm clear about the fact that politically he is my opponent, he's my enemy, and he is clear about the fact that you have to put into place a series of controls that will preserve the social order. That's the only purpose for this stuff.
Many in the media have been challenging the power of the surveillance state too, relying on leaks because they can't always get access to insiders who are afraid to speak. The NSA has invited some journalists in, like for this pro-NSA CBS 60 Minutes report.
The agency gave 60 Minutes unprecedented access to NSA headquarters, where we were able to speak to employees who have never spoken publicly before. Full disclosure, I once worked in the office of the Director of National Intelligence, where I saw firsthand how secretly the NSA operates.
Senior correspondent John Miller later left the network to join the New York Police Department as an intelligence official. Miller asked some softball questions, ostensibly trying to understand what the NSA does and doesn't do.
You don't hear the calls.
You don't hear the call.
You don't see the name.
You don't see the names.
You just see this number called that number.
This number, the to from number, the duration of the call, and the date time group. That's all you get. And all we can do is tell the FBI that number is talking to somebody who is very bad. You ought to go look at it.
Later, a widely read website showcased another interview by HBO comedian John Oliver asking, what does it say about the U.S. press that the toughest interview Keith Alexander has is from a comedian?
It's been said that your motto was collect everything. Is that true?
For specific problems.
Right. But you do understand that collect everything is also the motto of a hoarder. That's the fundamental principle which ends up with someone living alongside 1,500 copies of newspapers from the 1950s and 6 mummified cats.
Former officials like General Alexander were off limits to our series, as Vanny Vines of the NSA made clear, rejecting our request for a tour. Thank you for writing. Given the volume of such media requests, we can't assist you at this time with your project. The NSA had been created in secret and designed to be invisible, although it's hard to hide more than 30,000 employees with a vast number of buildings. Their tightly guarded headquarters here in Maryland covers more than 325 acres. They have a small army to protect it from enemies, foreign and domestic, as well as their own fire department and SWAT team. Yet these days, you don't have to get on the inside for a stage tour of the NSA to know what's happening. And that's thanks to the whistleblower they're all paranoid about. One man, former contractor Edward Snowden alone, is suspected of making off with millions of documents that we have only seen a fraction of. He's been called an insider threat.
I'm just another guy who sits there day to day in the office, watches what's happening, and goes, this is something that's not our place to decide. The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong.
In a recent appearance for TED, an organization that features diverse speakers, Snowden said he would do it all again, despite his notoriety and the charges against him.
And I want to make it very clear that I did not do this to be safe. I did this to do what was right. And I'm not going to stop my work in the public interest just to benefit myself.
NSA Deputy Director Rick Legett later condemned Snowden at another TED Talk.
I do not like the way that he did it. I think there were a number of other ways that he could have done that would have not endangered our people and the people of other nations through losing visibility into what our adversaries are doing. But I do think it's an important conversation.
Snowden's secret files have sparked a global controversy and debate about the role of American surveillance that seems to have the world as its target. It has fueled debates in almost every country.
They're damaging here in the United States because people obviously know what the government is doing. But the damage done internationally is spectacular. Not only did they get a lot of governments really upset with them, that they can patch over. But masses of people throughout the world know that the United States government is surveilling them. And this is a major, major problem for them.
Much of the focus of public anger is directed at this vast agency known by its three initials, NSA, the National Security Agency, also called a shadow factory or an enigma wrapped in a riddle. The author of this book, journalist James Bamford, has even made a documentary about the NSA for a public TV science series.
For those in the know, the joke was always that NSA stood for no such agency. For those on the inside, the joke was that NSA stood for never say anything.
Bamford and a small army of critics are now dueling with former NSA officials and their defenders. Lawyer Robert Litt works for the Director of National Intelligence and downplays the dangers of the NSA.
The intelligence community and the executive branch is subject to significant accountability. We have accountability to the Congress. People may question whether that accountability is good enough, whether it's structured properly, but we still have a degree of accountability, and the president, of course, is ultimately accountable to the public.
The NSA is trying to convince the public that it's not dangerous, but at the same time it's become obsessed with dangers within, a so-called insider compromise that is now consuming their attention. In the post-Snowden period, the U.S. government is facing a big problem internally to deal with what they call insider threats. As many as 4,000 people they suspect of perhaps getting involved in leaking documents or being an insider threat. On the other hand, they have a problem from Congress and the media, which is denouncing the NSA and denouncing surveillance. So they've come up with a new term and a new program. It's in this report here, National Security Through Responsible Information Sharing. Now, what does that mean? It's not really clear, but the idea is to coordinate the intelligence community and to have the people in Washington linked up to the people at the local level, even at the tribal level, on Indian reservations to try to create an integrated police state apparatus. At least it could be used for that, although right now it's just for responsible information sharing. And one of the things about this book that I found interesting was the acronyms, the nicknames of all the organizations that are part of this network. 6 pages of acronyms of organizations in the responsible information sharing environment. To explore the mentality of analysts and tech wizards who do the same work that Snowden did, we met Brad Sumrall, a darknet programmer and former military intelligence contractor.
That you were, in a way, doing what Ed Snowden was doing at one point. Can you tell us about that?
Basically the exact same job. I mean, depending on what government building you're in, I mean, it's still the same thing. It's the same rack of servers. You still have the SIPR net there. You have the regular garrison internet. If you went out into the field, you have the tactical internets or networks.
So when Snowden was monitoring information of various kinds, he had, I guess, clearances. Did you have clearances as well?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and he's on the SIPR net.
So in doing all of that stuff, were you very conscious of the material that you were dealing with being of a high security nature?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, you have all the sensitive databases right there.
Even as intelligence agencies try to keep their staffs in line, reporters have become another enemy and maybe a bigger threat, with many hard-hitting reports winning major media prizes and pitting leaders of the mainstream press against the lack of transparency by the NSA.
That awarding the Pulitzer to Snowden enablers is a disgrace. Anything you'd like to say back to him about that?
You know, I mean, I look at Peter King's condemnation as an enormous badge of honor.
Why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
The scandal that arose in Washington before our stories began was about the fact that the Obama administration is trying to criminalize investigative journalism by going through the emails and phone records of AP reporters, accusing a Fox News journalist of the theory that you just embraced, being a co-conspirator with felonies for working with sources. If you want to embrace that theory, it means that every investigative journalist in the United States who works with their sources, who receives classified information, is a criminal. And it's precisely those theories and precisely that climate that has become so menacing in the United States. It's why the New Yorker's Jane Mayer said investigative reporting has come to a standstill.
What do you say to those journalists that have been also highly critical of this kind of reporting on the Edward Snowden revelations? People like David Gregory that are asking if Glenn Greenwald should be prosecuted.
It's outrageous. I don't know how he can call himself a journalist and talk like that. I mean, look, this is the job. I mean, the job is we're supposed to report the truth. If whistleblowers come forward, we're supposed to take the risk along with those whistleblowers. And society long ago decided that we're supposed to have protections when we do this.
This is what journalism is about, shining a light on what the most powerful people in the country are doing to them in the dark. So we're going to continue to do that no matter what David Gregory and his friends say.
This series will take you to a high-level media summit held inside the New York Times that debated the role of leaks and the need to defend the press.
Well, I think there is a need for pushback. This conference is a step in that direction, and there are reporters and even mainstream news organizations that are pushing back. So there's an important fight going on here.
The NSA could not have access to as high a volume of emails and communications without the full cooperation of telecom companies and internet providers. This relationship has blossomed into a surveillance industrial complex with a flow of personnel back and forth between the NSA and its contractors.
As the internet expanded, corporations, I think, saw the possibility of making huge profits and really jumped into it very, very aggressively. But the important thing to note is that the real heavy-duty corporate involvement in the internet is only about 6 or 7 years old. That's when they've really swept in.
Events like 9/11 enabled the NSA to grow into a $60 billion enterprise, with 70% or $42 billion going to contractors, some led by former NSA executives. In October 2001, the NSA had only given 55 contracts to 144 contractors. By October 2003, that number had grown to 7,197 contracts for 4,388 companies. Snowden had been an NSA employee who left to work for a company called Booz Allen Hamilton, run in part by a former NSA director. Private companies like these were given access to the NSA's top secrets. This also led to an expansion of spying, even as government studies found that the FBI and CIA screwed up by not applying the intelligence they had but couldn't process to stopping 9/11. Under pressure from President Bush and Vice President Cheney, the agencies decided that traditional legal restraints no longer mattered.
So immediately after 9/11, it was somewhat shocking to me that there was a general feeling that was being expressed that the rules didn't matter anymore, that the FBI had been unleashed, and we were now allowed to investigate who we want and not worry about the legal restraints. And it concerned me greatly because I knew from the history of the FBI that would lead the FBI into a dangerous area that was going to impact the civil liberties of innocent people and not improve security, in fact, even harm security. And I think that's essentially what's happened.
Keep in mind, the Patriot Act is what allowed them to grow. They were so, kind of insignificant. They did a few little things, but then all of a sudden they became the number one with a big, fat check.
In addition to their huge budgets, technological supremacy, and backing from key politicians who are supposed to exercise oversight, NSA had always counted on support from a fearful public. That's changing, says attorney Ben Weisner of the ACLU.
I think they're so used to getting their way, they're so used to being able to invoke the threat of terrorism and having everybody roll over, that they're surprised by this environment where those kinds of dangerous threats are not scaring the public into submission. But ultimately this is about what they do and not what they say. And I don't think that there is a great defense.
No, nothing new for me, because back in the 1980s it was common knowledge that the NSA was using many of the same tools that it's alleged or it's come out to have been using today.
Why do you think that is? Why are they doing what they're doing?
It's not an ideological issue because you have Democratic presidents, you have Republican presidents, you have the far left, the far right. They all agree on one thing. We all want to know what everybody else is doing.
So spying is in our gene pool.
Yeah, spying is in the American gene pool, unfortunately.
Coming up next, more on how the NSA does what it does. We'll tell you about its collection program that enables it to spy on the internet and all of us. You have a right to know what they're doing, and we will tell you.
We're here at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. There are more spies here in D.C. than anywhere else in the world, so it's appropriate that we have this institution that really tells the complete story of espionage internationally.
When you travel to America's capital, Washington, D.C., if you can afford the admission, you can visit this International Spy Museum to relive the glories of the Cold War, complete with an exhibit on James Bond's evil adversaries. What you won't find is any reference to the current surveillance spying scandal.
The key aspects of espionage, that deception, that art of hiding information and disclosing information really has remained the same.
And this is the capital of it, Washington, D.C.
Absolutely. Washington, D.C. is certainly the capital of espionage.
And the capital of deception in many ways.
Yes, absolutely.
Outside of Washington, in the Maryland suburbs, is the capital of that capital.
Merge onto K9 Road, then your destination will be on the left.
The National Security Agency. This super secret spy agency is not hospitable to tourists or most reporters who want to know what's happening now. We found that out when we were told we were not welcome at this heavily guarded federal facility. It has more than 30,000 employees, 32 miles of roads across 325 acres. We were threatened with a $500 fine for even asking about entering, although later the NSA gave us some footage. These students at a nearby local university were threatened with arrest for photographing an NSA building on their campus where whistleblower Ed Snowden once worked.
Yeah, you can't take pictures. You can't take pictures of the building? This building, you can't take pictures. Not at all? What about it?
NSA used to stand for Never Say Anything. This has changed because the surveillance state is in the news every day. Americans know it exists, but few really understand what it does and how. To find out, also, don't bother visiting the NSA website.
I'm often asked the question, what's more important, civil liberties or national security? It's a false question. It's a false choice. At the end of the day, we must do both.
You will only find out what they want you to know, that they are here to defend and protect you. They claim to be accountable in legal and moral terms.
We have to find the way to ensure that we support the entirety of the Constitution. That was the intention of the framers of the Constitution. That's what we do on a daily basis at the National Security Agency.
How true is that? We will investigate the claims and the realities in this episode of America's Surveillance State. What does the NSA do? It's a simple question, but because it's a top-secret agency, a clear understanding has been hard to grasp. The agency is not required to release even non-classified information. On November 6, 1998, NSA for the first time declassified this organization chart of its operations directorate. You'll note some of this document is blacked out. It also only shows part of NSA's mission, including military support, intelligence oversight and policy, global issues and military production, and here, what they call collection operations. That's another word for electronic eavesdropping. It has become well known but also controversial because of all the data that is being collected and stored.
You have this incredible advances in technology that enable much more collection than ever was possible, and an increase of secrecy around the program. So it's very unclear still, not just what the government is doing, but what legal authorities it thinks allows it to do what it's doing.
Mike German, a veteran undercover FBI agent, knows surveillance techniques because he's used them.
It's an enormous problem for the government to know more about the people than the people know about what the government's doing. And what we've seen since the terrorist attacks of 9/11 is that a lot of the legal restraints that kept the government in check after a previous era of abuse were relaxed or removed completely in many cases.
The NSA was created secretly 60 years ago, not by Congress, but by the president, as a tool of the Cold War. But it always got less attention than the spooks, spies, and assassins who built the CIA's mystique as the invulnerable and omnipotent overthrower of governments and silencer of America's enemies. CIA scandals, including a recently leaked document detailing its role in torture and abuse, became well known, even as the NSA's better funded operations were downplayed because they were considered the province of super nerds, boys with toys like satellites, cables, and supercomputers. NSA hires more mathematicians than any other federal agency. Ray McGovern was in the CIA and rose to become a briefer of presidents. He worked for 7 presidents and 9 directors of Central Intelligence. He says he joined because he believed in the mission.
The ethos of intelligence work that attracted me was symbolized by the scriptural quote on the foyer of the CIA's new building. It was new in 1963 when I came on under John Kennedy, and it said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Okay, and I said, looked at that, and I remembered the constant dictum of my Irish grandmother: be truthful and honest, and then you won't give a damn what anyone says about you. Okay, and so I looked at it and I said, well, Grandma, if that's true, no pun intended, it's going to be a good place to work.
Eventually, like many professionals, he became disillusioned, retiring early. As a member of the intelligence community, he came to know the NSA's work well.
NSA did play a role. We learned things about the Soviet Union we never would have known before. It was done with judiciousness, and above all, it was done with respect to what they call the First Commandment out there at Fort Meade, NSA. Thou shalt not collect information, eavesdrop on Americans without a court warrant. That was the rule. That was the First Commandment. When Cheney came in, he said, they called General Hayden, who was head of NSA at the time, he said, General Hayden, I know about that First Commandment at NSA. I know about that. Forget about it. Forget about it. And that was before 9/11.
So the decision for the NSA to begin collecting information on everyone and everything started with an order from above.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was Dick Cheney and George Bush. The other thing, of course, that needs to be said is that the technology allowed that for the first time. And so when you had the sort of the rubric here, collect everything, which clearly is their motto now, collect everything. And then they say, well, what people say, what about the problem with the haystack, finding the needle in the haystack? Well, the answer to that, they say, is you got to make sure you had the whole haystack.
This NSA document leaked by Ed Snowden describes their collection program this way: collect it all, sniff it all, know it all, process it all, exploit it all. NSA whistleblower Russ Tice says the agency is still downplaying its collecting process to make it sound harmless.
They're lying about what they have and their capabilities and what they're doing. They're archiving everything. Their idea is, we'll archive everything. We're going to take everything. And then they say, oh, well, we don't collect. Well, then they're lying, of course, but their definition of collect is to have some human analyst look at this email or listen to this phone call or whatever. Well, of course, that's nonsense. They've collected it, and they have it for for an indefinite period of time, but they're not going to call it collected until someone looks at it. And of course, there's no way we have enough humans on this planet to listen to every communication that happens.
They are also not talking about how collecting everything makes it harder to produce relevant intelligence.
Is there a danger of valuable information getting lost because so much is collected? I mean, this is what they said after 9/11. They had information about these hijackers, but nothing was done because there was so much information they couldn't figure out who to go after.
And the Boston bombers and the underwear bombers and the shoe bombers, all these things, because they say you got to look for a needle in the haystack. Well, part of my job in that world was to make sure to limit the size of the haystack. That way you don't have as much hay to go through to look for the needle. And what they're doing is just dumping on more hay. You don't have a haystack anymore. You have a mountain of hay to go through.
State surveillance today is now cheap, it's undetectable, it's pervasive, and it's available at the click of a mouse. As a result, entire populations, rather than individuals, now live under constant surveillance.
Whistleblower Ed Snowden went through that hay and saw a lot of disturbing images, wars, and abuses. As a network administrator, he had access to all the databases and soon realized that he had the power to spy on anyone. In a video prepared for a televised debate, he explained.
Despite policy, I, as an NSA analyst sitting at my desk, had the technical authority to wiretap anyone, from a federal judge to the President of the United States, without getting out of my chair, as long as I had a private email address. And that's not a boast. In fact, some of these cases have already happened. In 2009, the New York Times reported that an NSA analyst used our state surveillance infrastructure to improperly access Bill Clinton's email. And other NSA workers have used state surveillance to spy on their lovers, ex-girlfriends, and other individuals who are obviously not suspected of any crime at all or any kind of wrongdoing. It's important to note that none of those individuals were ever charged with crimes. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that?
Journalist Glenn Greenwald has now released some of Snowden's documents in his new book that confronts the NSA head-on.
The same rhetoric is constantly invoked, which is if you shine a light on what we in political power are doing in a way that we haven't authorized you to do, you're going to have blood on your hands. I mean, there's an obvious irony to being accused by a U.S. general who served in Iraq, of all places, of having blood on your hands or causing the death of innocent people. Nobody could ever surpass Keith Alexander and his fellow generals in their ability to do that.
What we've seen is a expansion of what we call secret law, where they're either working under authorities that the American public doesn't know about, or even worse, there is a law in the books, but they're interpreting it in a way that an objective reading of that law wouldn't ordinarily allow.
The NSA in the hot seat. Documents leaked by Edward Snowden show that the NSA may have been spying on Chancellor Angela Merkel. An old mobile phone number she used is listed in those documents. Germany not happy.
Soon, thanks to the Snowden disclosures and media investigations, we found out that the NSA was collecting intel on 122 foreign leaders, even U.S. allies like the Chancellor of Germany and the President of Brazil. 35 leaders had their calls monitored.
For Germany, it is unacceptable that the mobile phone of our Federal Chancellor may have been subject to surveillance activities by our American partners. For us, spying on close friends and partners is totally unacceptable.
The NSA speaks of its work in neutral and non-threatening language, using terms like collection, telephony metadata. What does that mean? We asked former FBI undercover agent Mike German.
I mean, you would normally think in the terms of the Fourth Amendment that any time the government is collecting information about you, gathering it, putting it in a government database, that would be collection. But often the way the authorities that govern government surveillance are interpreted, sometimes the acquisition of information versus the collection of information are two different things, and they're only considering it collected once a human being has actually put eyes on it and process the information.
In May 2014, former NSA Director Michael Hayden shocked a Washington audience when he said that the NSA uses metadata to kill people, a reference to NSA providing intelligence to military units using drones to assassinate people the Pentagon and the White House consider enemies. Hayden quickly backtracked, saying, "We don't do that in the U.S."
Okay? We kill people based on metadata. But that's not what we do with this metadata. Okay?
Thankfully. Wow, I was working up a sweat there for a second.
Hayden, now working with a former Homeland Security chief, was also embarrassed in October 2013 when he was overheard by a fellow train passenger who began tweeting the content of his confidential phone conversation. Using a secret FISA court to do its bidding, the NSA pressed the government to order phone companies like Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and Nextel to turn over a massive number of records. Later we learned about a program called PRISM. Here's the secret NSA document that shows what it does to collect Internet data. Virtually everything we do and say online from all the big companies.
Well, they're collecting everything they can collect, and that is everything. They've been doing that without any adult supervision. The White House, the committees in Congress who are supposed to be exercising oversight, right? They're the overlook committees, not the oversight committees, and they're complicit in that. Not only that, but you have these 15 faux judges from the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court.
Faux means phony, right?
Yeah, F-A-U-X, yeah. And so what you have, Danny, and this is important, the first time in my life, you have the executive, you have important people in the legislative branch, the heads of the intelligence committees, and you have 15 judges on the FISA court, all sort of enmeshed, all complicit in this gross violation of the Fourth Amendment. And you start out asking about NSA, what it stands for? Now it stands for no such amendment. No such amendment.
Just to summarize, what is NSA? NSA is the largest, most costly, and most technologically sophisticated spy organization the world has ever known. It filters millions of phone calls and emails an hour. It has computers programmed to watch for hundreds of thousands of names. Its computers cost tens of millions and carry strange names like Black Widow. They run at special speeds most of us have never heard of, hundreds of teraflops that can lead to hundreds of trillions of operations per second. NSA headquarters is 4 times bigger than the U.S. Capitol.
I love the place. I went into the military and the Air Force when Ronald Reagan was president. I was full throttle. We were fighting the Cold War against the evil Soviet Union, and I was a full believer. I mean, I was gung ho, and you know, I'd be the guy that would get in early and stay late, and you know, I wanted to do my job, and I loved the place.
Russ Tice typified the NSA mentality. A space engineer, he believed in their clandestine mission and was totally dedicated. He worked in super-secret so-called black world programs until he discovered that the satellites were not just spying on America's enemies.
In one of these programs, I found out that we were using satellite technology to spy on American citizens.
Spy on American citizens.
Yes.
You're not supposed to do that, right?
No. In NSA, every 6 months, you go through a program where they drill it into your head, we call it UCID 18, that you will not spy on Americans, and for one incident of spying on Americans, you can go to jail for 5 years, for one incident. And they drill that into your head, and we all believe that we will never do this to our fellow citizens.
William Binney was a 40-year veteran of NSA who also went off the reservation because he saw the agency straying from its job. He was interviewed by Democracy Now!
the Congress and the administration have been fed by the intelligence community what I call techno-babble. In other words, they're being bamboozled into thinking a certain way, that they have to do this in order to get terrorists, and that's simply false.
Speaking of terrorists, the most dramatic NSA story we heard came from Thomas Drake, who became an executive at NSA on the day of a terrorist attack, September 11th, 2001.
Almost 3,000 people were murdered. The workforce knew that this was not just a passing crisis. The workforce knew that we had utterly failed the nation. We under the Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution, government has two primary responsibilities. One is to provide for the common defense, the other is to provide for the general welfare. Here we utterly failed. We had not kept people out of harm's way. We had not protected the nation.
There was a feeling of guilt there because the NSA had information on some of the men who skyjacked those planes that were flown into buildings, but they did not share it with other agencies. Thomas Drake became an eyewitness to how the agency changed.
So I became eyewitness to NSA unchaining itself with the approval and the mandate of the White House, unchaining itself from the Fourth Amendment, literally, and entering into a mass surveillance regime, the likes that history has never seen before.
As he became critical of the agency's failures, he became a whistleblower and faced years in prison for going public with NSA failures. Unlike Edward Snowden, he did not leak masses of documents.
That was one of the fundamental rules, whether it was oral communication, whether it was written, electronic, or later on even in hard copy, it was all unclassified, period.
What's not appreciated is that Snowden has been as careful in assembling information as he has been in disseminating information.
If I had just wanted to harm the U.S., that you could shut down the surveillance system in an afternoon. But that's not my intention. And I think for anyone making that argument, they need to think, if they were in my position, and you live a privileged life, you're living in Hawaii in paradise and making a ton of money, what would it take to make you leave everything behind?
Thanks to what we've learned from Snowden's disclosures, it seems like all of us have been reduced to the data we convey.
When you engage in an electronic transaction, whether it's with your cell phone, with a regular traditional landline phone, with your credit card, with your computer, the transaction itself, the content of the communications is called content. If you buy something at the store with your credit card, what you bought is considered content. But there are all sorts of electronic trails left, like crumbs, that often have a tremendous amount of very detailed information about you, particularly when it's gathered in mass. For example, who you called, when you called them, how long you were on the call with them, where you made the call from. That type of data collected in mass can reveal an awful lot of information about you.
In May 2014, Washington finally took legal action against cyber spying by China, not the United States, even as some of the Snowden documents revealed that economic espionage is also in NSA's portfolio. The Chinese and U.S. critics laughed at what they called hypocrisy.
The United States deliberately made up facts, using the excuse of so-called stealing of secrets online to indict 5 Chinese military officials. This has seriously violated the basic principles of international relations and damaged Chinese-US cooperation and mutual trust.
Americans think it's okay if we spy on foreigners, but it's not okay if we spy on Americans, as if, the rest of the world has no right to privacy at all.
We are more worried about Al-Qaeda than, I think, any nation state as a threat to American lives. But nonetheless, I think we have to rein in an agency that has the ability to spy on any innocent citizen with impunity of any country in the world. I mean, when the world becomes the NSA's panopticon, even with a fig leaf of privacy around Americans, that to me does seem unacceptable, and it turns the whole world against us.
Coming up next, the NSA and the press, how spying and intimidation has led America's mainstream media to push back and publish leaks and disclosures that would have once been unthinkable. The press versus the NSA, coming up next in this documentary series on America's surveillance state. The New York Times is considered America's most powerful newspaper. Its offices near Manhattan's Times Square projects that power for a media institution that often sets the political agenda and tells us what's important. And yet today, there is also fear and loathing inside New York Times newsrooms, where journalists increasingly feel threatened, even intimidated, by an administration that has prosecuted more whistleblowers, 8 in all, than any other in American history. In March 2014, the Times Conference Center hosted a forum to address the state of press freedom. Packed, it was like a media summit of major players there to resist the growing power of the surveillance state. Distributed at the event was this 2014 report on attacks on the press. The Committee to Protect Journalists charges that the NSA puts journalists under a cloud of suspicion. We're at the New York Times Center in Manhattan for a conference on sources and secrets. Some of the top journalists in America are here to debate and discuss the growth of the surveillance state in America. Journalists feel threatened. Politicians now feel threatened. This seems to be an issue that's gone from the back pages to the front page. Ralph Engelman works with the Polk Awards, sponsoring a respected awards ceremony in an industry that is far more competitive than collaborative.
Confidentiality of sources is central to the work of journalists, investigative journalists in particular. And in addition to the use of the Espionage Act, what we've learned from the Snowden revelations about the NSA, how can you guarantee confidentiality?
Engelman sees this event not just as a get-together for reporters, but one with an important political mission.
I think there is something that has not been said directly that needs to be said, and that is that the sort of political context for this whole crisis in terms of journalism and surveillance and the use of the Espionage Act of 1917. If you go back to the original Act of 1917, it was passed in large measure to suppress anti-war sentiment against U.S. entry into the war, First World War. It's not simply a question of journalistic practice, but it's also a question of American foreign policy, the ability of journalists and the public to follow what's going on.
At issue today is the case of James Risen, a Times reporter who exposed warrantless wiretapping.
You know, so after we had reported on the story and nailed it down, we went to the government for comment. In fact, I went to Michael Hayden, who was then the director of the NSA, and got him on the phone and told him what we were writing. And before he realized what he was doing, he had given me an on-the-record comment. And then, very quickly after that, he and the Bush administration started putting pressure on my editors, demanding that we not run the story.
Former veteran CIA analyst Ray McGovern says that at first there was an effort to suppress Risen's story.
James Risen had this story in the summer of 2004. It was that Dick Cheney and George Bush had told General Hayden to collect everything and forget about this First Amendment at NSA about not collecting on Americans while the court, or just collect everything, okay? Now, that was discovered in the summer of 2004, but the New York Times superiors of James Risen went to the White House and said, and the election is coming up, and so George Bush said, don't, that's national security, terrorism, fear, national security, do not publish that story.
The Times initially sat on the report, but then Risen told his boss, publisher Arthur Sulzberger, that this story will be told in his new book. The Times publisher then told the White House the newspaper would be going ahead.
And so Sulzberger calls the White House and says, I'm sorry, we're going to have to publish on that now. Bush orders him into the Oval Office to tell him, no, you can't do that.
He orders the publisher of the New York Times into the White House.
Right. And the publisher of the New York Times and the Washington bureau chief dutifully show up there, and Bush says, you can't do that. Okay, now this is the 5th of December, 2005. You can't do that, okay? And they said, well, you know, hey, we held off for 15 months, for God's sake, you know, you got to understand. So what happened here is that the New York Times caved, and Michael Hayden was asked to explain all this in January of 2006, so 1 month after Risen's revelation. He gets up before the National Press Club, and he's asked by Jonathan Landy, it's right on it's on YouTube, General Hayden, why is it that you have sort of played fast and loose with the Fourth Amendment?
Fourth Amendment actually protects all of us against unreasonable search and seizure.
But
that's what it says.
The measure is probable cause, I believe.
The amendment says unreasonable search and seizure.
But does it not say probable?
No.
But the NSA director was wrong. Probable cause is in the Fourth Amendment. But Risen is still being ordered by the courts to reveal his source, and he's resisting, leading to an ongoing clash and a possible jail term.
They're trying to kind of create a path for accepted reporting, and that if you as a reporter go outside those parameters, that you'll be punished, and that the sources that you are trying to deal with will be prosecuted.
Media old-timers like retired Times editor Seymour Topping sees a larger context too.
We're living in a period of terrorism, of danger on questions affecting national security, and therefore the whole question of the role of the press becomes, and its relationship with the government becomes more and more important. It's important that the public become more and more aware of the problems confronting the press.
Journalists in the building, like Bill Kovach and other former Times bureau chief, were also very conscious of what happened to another building in New York, the World Trade Center, creating the pretext for the rise of massive government spying.
When the Trade Center went down, all bets were off. Who was going to challenge the government? Nobody was. We didn't do it. The press didn't do it. The government had the opportunity, and George W. Bush opened all the doors.
So fast forward to the present day, we have situations where newspapers like the one you work for here are actually willing to work with whistleblowers and bring out information that maybe in the past they wouldn't have done as quickly, although we do have the Pentagon Papers.
And I helped work on the Pentagon Papers. We were ready to do it. The Times was ready to do it at any time if they could confirm the information. You know, we got the Pentagon Papers dumped, but we rented 2 floors of a hotel over here for a month and vetted that data ourselves, so we did our own reporting.
Mr. Ehrlichman, are you telling me that the break-in to Dr. Fielding's office was to satisfy the President of the United States?
The President wanted very much to make sure that a thing like this could not happen again. How one learned whether Ellsberg acted alone, as a disgruntled employee of a think tank, whether he acted as a member of an international spy ring delivering secrets to a foreign embassy, or just what his role was, where he fit had to be determined, in the opinion of the investigators, by every available means.
Do you have a sense of mission, which is unusual in journalism, a sense of, you're actually uncovering something of value and importance to the American people?
That's the only reason to be a journalist. I mean, democracy, you know as well as I do, democracy only survives on a population that has the kind of information that allows them to make a decision to help make a democracy work. And if the press doesn't do it, who will?
This is not just an American problem. Journalists in other countries are being spied on too by the NSA and their own intelligence agencies, says Tim McNulty.
If you look at journalists in other countries, they risk a great deal more than we risk. We may be, prosecuted, or we may end up with adverse publicity or things like that, but we rarely feel that our lives are threatened, that our livelihoods are threatened, that our families. The journalists in many other countries are not only more aggressive, they're more courageous.
This Sources and Secrets conference included exchanges with representatives of the intelligence community who argued that whistleblowers like Edward Snowden should be in prison.
It is my personal opinion, Jim Risen called me out on this, that people who leak classified information commit crimes, and if we can catch them, which is not always easy, we ought to prosecute them and they ought to go to jail.
Here's Robert Litt, who is general counsel for the Director of National Intelligence.
There are many, many things that the government believes need to be kept secret in the national interest. And there's a full recognition of the fact that the press is almost invariably going to balance that interest different than the government does. And so there's going to be necessarily an adversarial relationship. And the question is, what kind of processes can we set up to ensure that that adversarial relationship is a productive one rather than a destructive one?
The panels also included journalists who have been disseminating and publishing secrets leaked by Snowden, like the Washington Post's Barton Gellman, and independents like Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras.
Edward Snowden is a rock star to some. To others, of course, he is a traitor. And here today, via Skype, we have the three journalists who were entrusted by Snowden, chosen by Snowden, to be the recipients of top-secret NSA archives. Do you feel it's essential? Do you systematically run by the government, ask for government response on the stories you've done on the Snowden revelations or other stories about the NSA?
We've had a legal framework since, the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Espionage Act of 97 years ago, with which a government could prosecute journalists for talking about secrets. And it has been a legal culture, a political culture, that's created the barriers to that.
Greenwald and Poitras have worked directly with leading newspapers to report secrets buried in these documents.
He did not think that he should be in the position to decide which documents ought to be published and which ones ought to be suppressed. He came to well-established and well-regarded newspapers and asked the journalists in those institutions with whom he was working to make those judgments about what is in the public interest to publish and what is not. And specifically, at least to me, said, a lot of what I'm giving you is for background, for context, for understanding. But I don't think all of this should be published. If I just wanted all of this published, I wouldn't need you guys. I could have just uploaded it to the internet myself.
The thing that has, I think, been positive in terms of Snowden's disclosures is that it's reawakened an adversarial press, and that people have been shocked that these decisions about surveillance have been made completely in secret, completely without public debate. And that there does seem to be some kind of an awakening, but I wouldn't call it a shift of the pendulum.
And now, an initially skeptical American media has showered them with top prizes. Greenwald, Poitras, and Gellman won the admired Polk Awards. The next question, would the media honor Edward Snowden's contribution as a whistleblower? In the end, they didn't, but newspapers that carried his leaks did win the even more prestigious Pulitzer Prize. These reports were not always picked up or praised because establishment journalism does not trust crusaders like Greenwald and Poitras, says Rory O'Connor of Stony Brook University.
Because they're too independent, and because even as you heard the editors of the top publications here, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and New Yorker, and so on, all of them said on the panels today, in fact, that they have not been aggressive enough, that they have collaborated perhaps too much with the government in the past. These are the people who run the major media organizations being self-critical and saying, no, we don't need to have more humility, which is what was suggested by Mr. Litt, the representative of the NSA and the CIA. He said that the press needed more humility. I was pleased at least that the leaders of the mainstream organizations struck back against that and said, no, we don't need more humility, we need more aggressive reporting, and I agree with that.
Before the big prize was given, publications like the magazine Politico framed the challenge facing the powers who run establishment journalism. Wrote media critic Dylan Byers, honoring the NSA reporting would inevitably be perceived as a political act, with the Pulitzer Committee invoking its prestige on behalf of one side in a bitter national argument. Yet to pass on the NSA story would be to risk giving the appearance of timidity. The major media resolved the debate this way. They recognized the Snowden disclosures without recognizing him or the people closest to him. Snowden was magnanimous, saying today's decision is a vindication for everyone who believes that the public has a role in government. We owe it to the efforts of brave reporters and their colleagues who keep working in the face of extraordinary intimidation. Ben Weisner, Snowden's lawyer from the American Civil Liberties Union, also praised the press.
I do think that the last year in particular has been an extraordinary year for journalists, particularly American journalists, that they have been, courageous in standing up in the face of government claims of national security. That they have not ignored those government claims. They have redacted stories where appropriate, but in general, they understood that the balance had tipped far too much towards deference.
As the big media now recognize the value of whistleblowers in the press, other media outlets say they have to be more aggressive in their own reporting and not just rely on documents that are leaked. Jonathan Landay is an investigative reporter for the Washington Bureau of McClatchy Newspapers.
I don't email sources. We just broke the story on the big fight between the CIA and the Senate Intelligence Committee. Most of the groundbreaking work on that was done by a 22-year-old paid freelancer who did nothing but doorstep committees on the Hill, go to people's homes, got me doing that again, going out at night to visit people, and that's how we were able to do that without sort of like sitting in the office and taking phone calls.
The issues at this conference on the rights of the press also deal with another right, the right of the public to be informed about what governments do in their name. That's the focus of Amy Goodman's concern. Goodman is an anchor of a popular independent daily newscast called Democracy Now!
Information is the oxygen of a democracy. It's not just about participating in democratic processes. It's about being informed. That's what makes democracy meaningful. And when we don't have that information, when a very powerful entity, the government, has the information and the people don't, that is not a very healthy sign. It does not bode well for democracy.
Goodman is a strong believer in the Freedom of Information Act that guarantees access to government information when the act is respected. She cites one current example of the government insisting on keeping secret something that happened 60 years ago. The issue is the U.S. role, if any, in the arrest of South Africa's late leader Nelson Mandela in 1962. Ryan Shapiro, an MIT graduate student, is now suing for the information after the government turned down his request.
Ryan Shapiro, the graduate student at MIT, has sued for more information under the Freedom of Information Act than anyone in U.S. history. And one of the issues he cares deeply about is what happened to Nelson Mandela? How was it that he was picked up in the early 60s? Was it just the South African government, or was Nelson Mandela targeted by the CIA and intelligence given over to the South African apartheid regime? And why is it that something that took place more than half a century ago we can't learn about today? That is a very serious question. That doesn't have to do with national security. That has to do with embarrassment, and that is not acceptable.
In the end, this is a fight to keep the public informed.
You don't just achieve democracy. People have to fight for it every single day, have to be ever vigilant. So now that the information is out there, and we don't even have all of the information, people have to decide what they want to do, how much power they want to imbue in the government.
So what will come from calls to action like Amy Goodman's and mainstream media conferences decrying the problem?
You know, I think nothing will come out of events like this, honestly, to answer your question. You know, the final panel was entitled, "Where do we go from here?" But actually, there was very, very little of anyone addressing where we go from here. We're at a state here in the United States right now where the press is under attack by the Obama administration, a greater attack than any previous administration. In fact, than all previous administrations rolled together. And so what the question is, where does the media go from here, faced with this attack, faced with the threat of further imprisonment on the part of Times reporters like Jim Risen? You know, the mainstream media themselves are under attack. And I think that one thing I'm hoping you're going to see is a greater unity among the media.
NSA whistleblowers like Russ Tice say that the NSA at first labeled him paranoid to discredit him with the press.
Paranoid is right. They used paranoid. And they did it on purpose, I think, because they realized that if I ever did go to the press, that's exactly what they would say to the press. Because remember, back then, there aren't any, I'm the original NSA, whistleblower with this sort of thing. This is, 2004, 2005 time frame. So, when I finally did come out, that's exactly what they did. They said, you're talking to a crazy guy. Do you want your source to be the crazy guy?
So in other words, even though you had information and speculation that was informed, they basically attempted to discredit you.
Well, of course, yes.
But now whistleblowers are fighting back by working together and getting society and the media to recognize their contribution. Another recent award named after Ron Ridenour, a soldier who exposed the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, in which U.S. soldiers slaughtered villages and children, saluted Ed Snowden and the reporters bringing his documents to the public.
I'm very happy to be here, very honored to be here to make this introduction to two extraordinary people, Laura Poitras and Edward Snowden.
Author James Bamford, the first to expose NSA activities, introduced the winners. A live message by Ed Snowden, now living in exile in Russia, was heard.
Do you think it's right that the NSA is collecting more information about Americans in America than it is about Russians in Russia? Because that's what our systems do. We watch our own people more closely than we watch any other population in the world. Despite the protections, they are policy-based. The technical systems ingest and collect everyone in this room's communication. When you pick up the phone, when you make a call, when you make a purchase, when you buy a book, all of that is collected, and I could see it at my desk crossing my screen.
Former CIA analyst Ray McGovern says that journalists are not the only ones who fear the power of the NSA.
Then you ask about the journalists. You're asking about, well, everybody's afraid. I mean, it's not just the journalists. It's people like Barack Obama. It's people like Dianne Feinstein. Think about what the NSA has on Dianne Feinstein and her husband, who has made billions from defense and post office and all kinds of nice, cozy contracts, okay? So everybody's afraid, not just journalists.
Let me just understand this. You're saying that President Obama, in your opinion, informed opinion, has reasons to fear the power of the NSA, has to be careful in terms of the dance he's done about, yes, he'll reform it, but not too much.
Well, Danny, when you're collecting everything on everybody, you know. Who among us is as pure as Caesar's wife, you know? Everybody's got something to hide. That's the idiocy of these people that say, I got nothing to hide, you know? Well, you know, everyone has things they want to hide.
Coming up next in our surveillance series, the interface between the spy agencies and the technology companies. Can their cooperation be considered complicity in spying? Do they violate the trust of customers? Next.
Welcome.
The Internet was originally created by a government defense agency, but it quickly became a platform for the growth of a new industry worldwide, offering a wide range of attractive products and services. As the web became popular with hundreds of millions of users, intelligence agencies like the NSA decided to use it for its own purposes. An instrument for global communication soon became a tool for massive spying, part of a surveillance industrial complex. The vast super-secret National Security Agency took to the Internet like a fish takes to water. There is an often invisible but deep connection between a high-tech government intelligence service and the corporate world, as well as tensions between the companies, their customers, and the government. It works on many levels. First, the intelligence agency works with thousands of businesses who offer services and provide contractors. Some of the big ones are on an NSA advisory panel, and others are deeply complicit with its global spying and surveillance mission. At the same time that many are criticizing government spying, customers are pressuring their phone and internet companies, accusing them of violating their privacy. Here's one case documented in this chart shown in a lawsuit proving that AT&T set up a special room to intercept calls the government wanted to spy on. All of this collusion upsets the CEO of another tech company, Roy Singham of ThoughtWorks.
The sad part about this is it's really something that has undermined commerce, it's undermined privacy, it's undermined security. It is so hypocritical what these companies and governments have done to something that could have been so revolutionary, so important to the human race, this globalization of an internet economy. And it's been destroyed, quite frankly, by this collaboration.
The NSA is proud of its partnerships with many companies, as these documents released by Edward Snowden makes clear. The agency has made deals with corporations to provide data in exchange for information on threats against their operations, as these formerly secret documents show. This relationship is documented in journalist Glenn Greenwald's book, No Place to Hide. This leaked graphic refers to what NSA calls strategic partnerships, 80 major global corporations in all, including well-known computer, telephone, and internet companies. This graphic outlines the specific targets of NSA collection: email, video and voice chats, photos, stored data, and more. This document for fiscal year 2012 shows a 32% increase in cooperation from over 45,000 companies. The agency reports a strong growth in data from Google, up 63%, Facebook, up 131%, and Skype, up 248%. We asked NSA whistleblower Russ Tice about these partnerships.
It seems as if a lot of the technology companies are actually being paid to share their, quote, data with the NSA.
Absolutely. And In some respects, I have a little bit of sympathy for some of these companies because it's a carrot and a stick. Now, the carrot is, oh, by the way, we're going to pay you millions and tens of millions of dollars and beef up your bottom line for this information. The stick is, if you don't give us the information, we're going to make life miserable for you. We're going to cut back on your government contracts, and as the CEO of Quest Communications found out, we're going to put you in jail if we can find some nitty-gritty thing that we can pin on you. And I think he just got out of jail just a couple months ago.
Companies are often ordered to supply information for which they are paid. This is an actual court document showing that NSA requests to a foreign intelligence surveillance court results in orders to the company. The companies like this process because they can then claim they are being forced to cooperate and not because of all the money they make.
So in other words, there is intimidation, actually. This is really almost mafia-like.
Absolutely. This is extortion and blackmail.
But some of these companies engage in spying themselves. Challenges to Google's use of Street View cars seems on its way to the Supreme Court. Their role has the attention of Martin Smith, a producer at the PBS Frontline program. Smith says that businesses in Silicon Valley helped create the surveillance state.
That the cell phone that you carry tracks everything, everywhere you go. It increasingly tracks what you buy. Your email is scanned so that advertisements can be placed, but it's creating a turnkey surveillance state that is that everybody is participating in. It's not just journalists and their sources, but everybody is exposed. Their information, Google knows more about you than any institution on the planet at this point.
But these companies want you to sign privacy agreements. They claim to be protecting your privacy.
Well, they are. They do have privacy agreements, and if you took the time to read them, perhaps you could make a rational decision, but you'd never get out of your house. You'd be there reading these privacy agreements for months on end.
Alfredo Lopez runs an internet business to empower citizens.
You're a customer of a company, you sign a privacy agreement with them. They want you to, they have an implied contract with you to actually ensure that your data is treated confidentially and private.
Right.
But they've broken that, haven't they, many of them?
They've broken it, and they also, you have to really be careful. Google collaborates with the U.S. government. It's on a bunch of committees with the U.S. government. And its privacy and data protection agreement has more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese. So they can do literally anything they want with your data. In fact, Google writes into its Gmail agreement the ability to actually read your email. They claim it's for marketing purposes. But the same apparatus they use to read your email can also be used by some government official to figure out what it is you're talking about, and who it is you're talking to.
So this is a battleground, isn't it? Between the desire of people to communicate without being spied on and the insistence by the government to spy on them.
That is correct.
The companies require privacy agreements like these that customers think protect them. But many of these agreements are written by lawyers who know how to conceal or sanitize the real meaning. The language is deceptive, writes critic Wolf Richter. They're all doing it. They're part of the enormously hyped bubble of big data, whose business model is to collect and monetize your personal information, which has become part of a new asset class. And seeing this, the NSA is dying of data envy. At the same time, initially at least, most of the big companies would not discuss their involvement or deny it. Larry Page of Google said, "Press reports that suggest that Google is providing open-ended access to our users' data are false, period." Facebook's chief security officer Joe Sullivan said, "We do not provide any government organization with direct access to Facebook's servers." Later, Mashable reported Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and other tech giants knew of the existence of the secret NSA surveillance program, PRISM. NSA's general counsel says tech companies were aware of PRISM, they just didn't know it was called that.
early on in the debate, there were some statements by companies who may or may not have been involved in the program saying, well, we never heard of PRISM. But whether they ever heard of PRISM, any company that was from whom information was being obtained under 702 knew that it was being obtained.
Correct. PRISM is just an internal government term that as a result of the leaks became a public term, but collection under this program is done pursuant to compulsory legal process that any recipient company would have received.
According to Tom Gelton, a correspondent for National Public Radio, the NSA and many companies signed on to an ESF, Enduring Security Framework, to work together in a mutually rewarding way.
As part of what's called the Enduring Security Framework, chief executives of top U.S. corporations are brought to Washington 2 or 3 times a year for a one-day classified briefing. For each session, the CEOs get special top-secret clearances so they can be told about the latest in cyber weaponry. They can then go back to their companies and take steps to deal with the threats they hear about, threats they may not previously have taken seriously.
Suddenly, tech companies began spending millions to boost their images.
Right now, we exist in a surveillance state. I have no doubt in my own mind that we have, the corporate players and the government spies had put in place a mechanism where they can monitor almost everything at real time. And to assume that our secret policies, which are judged by courts that are secret, and issue mandates that are secret, to believe that this secret mechanism will safeguard us from devolving into a police state, I think is really the height of recklessness.
Al Jazeera published emails showing a close personal relationship between Google execs and NSA. No wonder journalist Glenn Greenwald says,
there almost is no division between the private sector and the NSA, or the private sector and the Pentagon when it comes to the American national security state. They really are essentially one.
Here's just one list of NSA private contractors.
And this goes back before 9/11. That NSA was increasingly in the internet age was increasingly going out to the defense, military, industrial defense, intelligence complex, and granting very, very large contract vehicles in the billions and billions of dollars to quote-unquote solve the big data problem, to solve the intelligence problem of the digital age.
Former NSA executive Thomas Drake told us a less expensive in-house surveillance program was later junked and replaced by one built by a private contractor, SAIC, at a much higher cost.
The dark secret, right, which I've continued to talk about, is that the very best of American innovation had already solved the problem. They just chose to ignore it. One particular program was called ThinThread, and it was developed for just over $3 million, but it didn't stand a chance against a program called Trailblazer, which was $4 billion, when it was awarded with great fanfare as a flywheel contract, the flagship program in which it would take NSA into the digital age. And that was in the spring of 2000. In fact, I was, again, told by the number 3 who I reported to, it says, you got to be at least 10 million to even get noticed. And 2, ThinThread came out of there was a signals, we call it Signals Intelligence Automation Research Center, otherwise known as SARC, it was really a center of excellence for.
But it was internal.
Internal, had about a dozen people, right? And guess what?
It was replaced by a
$4
billion project.
That $4 billion project had been already awarded. It was the corporate solution. You did not challenge the corporate solution. Even though the acquisition regulations, the contract regs, require you to determine if there are any alternatives or existing solutions that meet the requirements. Because you're outsourcing. This was a choice, another critical strategic decision that was made by General Hayden, which was we're going to buy the solution, not make it. There was no in between.
Working for spy agencies can become a company's profit center. The conglomerate that Edward Snowden worked for reportedly made over $1 billion servicing defense agencies like NSA.
Silicon Valley is escalating pressure on President Barack Obama to curb the U.S. government surveillance programs that vacuum personal information off the internet and threaten the technology industry's financial livelihood. A coalition that includes Google, Apple, Yahoo, Facebook, and Microsoft lashed out in an open letter printed Monday in major newspapers. The crusade united 8 companies that often compete fiercely against each other, but now find themselves banding together to limit the potential damage from revelations about the National Security Agency's snooping on web surfers.
As exposés of the corporate role mounted, foreign companies no longer wanted to do business in America.
There are reports rolling in saying that U.S. businesses are feeling fallout overseas from the NSA spying revelations. You normally wouldn't make the connection, but other countries are actually thinking twice now about buying goods that are made by U.S. companies.
Even Julian Assange of WikiLeaks commented on how American companies were being hurt.
You know, I've been involved in the tech industry for a long time. I know my friends in the US are really hurting as a result of of what has happened in the NSA. As far as the outside world is concerned, the United States has become an archipelago of coercion, where any person you were dealing with in business at Google or Facebook or Yahoo or at a telecommunications company might have become secretly an agent of the National Security Agency because they're ordered to do so by the FISA court, and they're forced to keep that secret or through the mechanism of national security letters.
One study reported that the U.S. cloud computing industry could lose as much as $36 billion in business. Even as companies challenged NSA access, a top-secret court that oversees surveillance has time and time again ruled for the NSA. Some companies like Microsoft published a secret internal manual to show employees how to cooperate with government requests. This one was leaked. This manual shows that the company set up a special portal for government agencies to make requests. Google decided to publicize the growing number of requests for information they were receiving to show how transparent they are. Then, for PR reasons, many companies began pressuring the government publicly to reform NSA.
You know, so frankly, I think that the government blew it, right? I think that they blew it on communicating what they were, basically the balance of what they were going for here with this. So, you know, the morning after this started breaking, there were like a bunch of people asked them what they thought, and the government's comment was, "Oh, don't worry. Basically, we're not spying on any Americans." Right? And it was like, "Oh, wonderful. Yeah, it's like that's really helpful to companies who are trying to serve people around the world and really going to inspire confidence in American internet companies. It's like thanks for going out there and being really clear about what you're doing." So I think that was really bad.
Some companies are now defying the NSA. Others say the government is irresponsibly blaming them unfairly. The tech industry is less thrilled that the White House is shining a light on their data collection practices through its big data report. Companies issued statements urging the White House to turn its attention back to how the NSA collects private data. Criticizing them, they say, is irresponsible.
I mean, we haven't had this kind of arrogance of American corporate government language, in my opinion, since the 50s. You know, when what's good for General Motors is good for America. And I think it's time that the businesses in the rest of the world took notice of this monopolization by U.S. corporations and said, this is not good for our countries, it's not good for our clients, it's not good for our customers, it's not good for the world.
At the same time, they have made videos like this to show the public how they handle requests for information on their customers.
In the course of a criminal investigation, sometimes the government requests information on Google users. Here's how we protect users' information from excessive requests, while also following the law. Let's say the federal authorities want information from Google about user HughDunnit22. Google protects your rights by upholding the Fourth Amendment. The law requires authorities to use a search warrant when seeking private content, like email. If there's enough evidence to support an application for a search warrant, the investigator heads to court. The judge inspects the application and, if satisfied, issues a search warrant.
To Alfredo Lopez, videos like this give the impression that these companies are being sensitive to customer concerns.
They say a range of things. Most of the time, the people that we interact with and the bodies that I'm with, and when I go to different activities, with hotsy-totsy people where they pay for your lunch and dinner, they say, "You're right, Alfredo, and we're working on that." Or it's another. See, everything is so compartmentalized and divided that it's a self-protection. They can protect themselves. They also, here is the problem. To see the picture this way, you have to have the politics to see the picture. And that's what I keep saying to people that I talk to all the time.
I think as somebody in the tech sector, something that's more upsetting to me is the lack of vigilance in the first place of the corporations and their hypocrisy in the defense of this, and they have no real plan to put pressure on the United States government or international bodies to protect their other citizens. Listen, we're a global business. I operate in 30 countries. We have people working, I think, in 15 countries right now. We have consumers, we have businesses in all these countries. Most global businesses do. Whom am I accountable to? Am I not accountable to my client in India or to my client in South Africa? Of course I am. You can't pretend that you like global business and then you think it's okay that one country and one set of countries, corporations have this unlimited license to exploit and spy on the rest of the world.
You cannot proceed from the premise that the government has the right to conduct surveillance against you or anyone else. It does not have that right under the Constitution of the United States. It says it clearly. And, all this stuff about, we have to surveil criminals and terrorists and everything. How do you know someone's a criminal? And how do you know someone's a terrorist? Why are you taking my email?
If these companies can collect this information, so can the government.
Martin Smith's Frontline series exposed corporate collusion with the NSA.
The Googles, the Facebooks collect as much of our sensitive data as possible.
But anything you hand to a private company is potentially government.
The NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone.
Corporate America and national security state know so much about us, and we know so little about them.
I do see it as one of the stories of our time. It affects us all here as to whether or not we're going to be adequately informed about what our government is doing. And we do have a First Amendment of free speech and a Fourth Amendment that need on search and seizure. We need protections. They need to be upheld.
Donald Byrd teaches journalism at Long Island University. He says not all of his students even recognize the problem.
Our students think that the internet is just a utility. You turn it on and it runs, it's water, electricity, whatever, and the internet really has to be the same. And they're on their machines all the time. I took a train to Chicago and back recently because my son's at Northwestern University, and the kids, they're all on their screens. They're not talking to each other. They're never going to meet a significant other.
Many of them may not know, may not care that other people are paying attention to what they're actually saying, or they're recording what they're saying. They're being monitored. They're being spied on.
I know that. I tell them that when I go into my Bank of America, there are 14 cameras on me, watching me. The cameras everywhere. We know that, and so forth. And I tell them never to text anything they wouldn't want their mother to read.
Is privacy dead then? I mean, personal privacy?
I think so. I think it is.
So in a sense, the NSA, by its desire to control everything, has actually led to the global resistance to it.
This is about economic, military, political, ideological, historical control. This is the fundamental nature of power in the world. Whoever controls the commanding heights of the new world economy, which is the internet, dominates the economic landscape for the next 50 years, then dominates the politics, and with that they dominate the political and military narrative. My sister, as a historian, and others have told me that when you have a chance to rewrite history, you control the future. This is also about changing the history of the past. That's dangerous. Victors write history. If we're not careful, we're going to create a situation where the history of the people who fought in the civil rights movement, that's going to be obliterated. How did Nelson Mandela go to prison? It was the American deputy ambassador who turned him in. Those facts of history will be conveniently discarded if we're not careful. And that's what's at stake, the future of history and the future of knowledge.
Coming up next, combating insider threats. The NSA's latest preoccupation since the disclosures by Edward Snowden created a firestorm. You will meet whistleblowers and hear their dramatic stories in the next episode of America's Surveillance State. The National Security Agency was set up to keep America safe.
People you know from within our organization can also cause harm. This threat is called the insider threat. An insider is a trusted member of our organization, such as an employee or contractor that intentionally causes harm.
It now seems obsessed with keeping itself safe.
If you see the following behavior, you should report it immediately to your supervisor or our security team.
Among the threats NSA and other government agencies are now facing are not the ones they first expected or prepared for. Insider threats. The NSA estimates that as many as 4,000 employees may not be trustworthy.
I was considered a rising star in my office, so it wasn't like I was the disgruntled employee.
Former NSA staffer Russ Tice says that after 9/11, the agency slowly turned on itself.
Matter of fact, when all this happened, my supervisor didn't even know what was going on. So when they yanked me out of my office, my supervisor was shocked and had no clue what was going on. So it was this insider thing that they're talking about, having basically employees snoop on other employees. That environment did not exist then.
But yet you must have been shocked to be singled out this way and be investigated.
I was, and they called me in for an emergency psych eval, and they bring this thing up and they say that I'm crazy because I think there could be a spy in the intelligence business. Lord forbid.
Here at their headquarters at Fort Meade in Maryland, the NSA mothership is well guarded in a cocoon of security against danger. Now, like other intelligence agencies, they are increasingly uptight, forcing employees to spy on each other. Here's an advisory from the U.S. Navy. NSA is run by a Navy admiral.
This is an unclassified brief on the insider threat. What is an insider threat? An insider who uses his or her access to harm national security interests or national security through unauthorized disclosure, data modification, espionage, or actions resulting in loss or degradation of resources or capabilities.
Here's another video, a dramatization produced for Homeland Security.
Would you recognize these situations as potential threats if they happen to you? Ted has been employed at his firm for 6 years. His firm's approaching a major security upgrade that has kept him working late into the evening, so he uses his lunch break to run a few errands close by the office. As he talks on his cell and walks back to his office, Ted notices a coworker, Doug Redman. Doug appears to have just handed a bulky folder to a man and then walked away.
This is a call for vigilance. If you see something, say something is its mantra. One unintended byproduct is that alarmist messages like this can intimidate employees into silence.
An unusual or alarming confluence of these situations may indicate a threat. You have the power to protect your workplace. If you see something suspicious from one of your coworkers, say something to your supervisor, human resources department, or your security officer.
Another insider who became a whistleblower says he was tagged when he began raising questions about spying on Americans. Former NSA executive Thomas Drake was threatened with prison.
Well, I was tagged early on as a problem because I was raising the gravest of concerns about NSA conduct shortly after 9/11. When I had that extraordinary encounter with the lead attorney in the Office of General Counsel, he said some very dark things in terms of what I was asking. I was saying, why are we in violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act? It has criminal sanctions. He says, you don't understand. The lawyers, all the lawyers have looked at it. It's all, and the White House has approved it. And then he said the following, which threw me right back to the Nixon administration. It's all legal. And as soon as he said it's all legal, the hair standing up on the back of my neck, because this is precisely what Nixon separated himself from the special oath that he took, which is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution.
Both Drake and Tice tried to bring their concerns to the agency's attention, but got nowhere.
There's been a lot of buzz from some pundits on television saying, well, Snowden should have gone inside and shared his concerns instead of going to the public with these secret documents.
Those avenues don't exist. That chain of command, the DOD IG, NSA's IG was totally in bed with the security office and the front office at Fort Meade at NSA. That's why I didn't even go to them. Matter of fact, back then I was friends with the deputy director of NSA. And I went to him, and he kind of acted like he didn't know what was going on when I talked to him very quietly in private. So I went to the DOD IG, I got nowhere. I went to the Merit System Protection Board only because I was a military veteran. If I wasn't a military veteran, they would have blown me off for that, because the intelligence service is exempt from the laws, from the Whistleblower Protection Act. They're exempt, and that's something you don't hear from these pundits when they're talking. They don't even bring that up. I don't even know if they know it themselves, but the Whistleblower Protection Act does not protect someone in the intelligence community.
What about Thomas Drake?
I became a whistleblower, and what I did in those weeks, months, and the next few years after 9/11 was use every available channel that was within the government to blow the whistle. And that included inside NSA, that included the Office of General Counsel, that included the Inspector General's office, that included obviously my supervisory chain.
But you did what you were supposed to do.
That included Congress, Department of Defense, and a number of others.
You did what you were supposed to do, go through channels, and Snowden didn't, and they're criticizing Snowden for not going through channels.
Well, he actually did go through channels. He's actually elaborated more on that in terms of detail. It's just that it never got anywhere.
Since our interview with Drake, Snowden spoke with NBC and revealed that he also tried to communicate with the NSA.
Now, I had raised these complaints not just officially, in writing, through email, to these offices and these individuals, but to my supervisors, to my colleagues, in more than one office. I did it in Fort Meade, I did it in Hawaii.
The NSA downplayed Snowden's charges, insisting they could only find one email of his. Later, NBC challenged that response and confirmed Snowden's story.
Look, the lawyer that I confronted in the Office of General Counsel, he warned me. He said, don't ask any more questions. You don't want to go there. And I chose to fight from within. Look, I was now eyewitness to the subversion of the Constitution. I was literally, my oath is on the line. I was not going to violate that oath. I was going to keep faith and allegiance to the oath. That oath is to support and defend the Constitution. It's the idea of how to govern ourselves, for all of its faults and foibles. Okay, historically, it is.
But you were warned, Tom.
I was warned. Yes, I was.
And.
But I wasn't going to stand silent and look away, because I'd be complicit.
Unlike Drake and other whistleblowers, Snowden released secret NSA documents. He decided that the only way to challenge them was to show the public what NSA was doing in its own words. Snowden didn't just dump secret documents to get them out. He sought out responsible journalists like Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and tried to put them in context. He asked them to protect the names of agents. At first, Greenwald was too busy to encrypt his communications with Snowden and almost didn't get his big scoop.
The lesson of that story, and the reason why I've proudly told it, is twofold. One is that here was somebody who, in retrospect, for very good reasons, was afraid to talk to me as a source coming to a journalist because he knew, unlike me at the time, the vast reach of this surveillance system. And so he would not talk to me or tell me anything about who he was or what he had until I installed encryption. And that's the broader point, is we talk a lot about the threat to privacy from the surveillance state, but how do you have a free press and engage in a healthy news gathering process when the government is monitoring people's communications and even collecting lists of everyone with whom we're communicating? And it sort of underscored the difficulty of doing journalism and speaking freely in an unencrypted environment.
Ironically, the NSA had for years lobbied to block encryption on the internet so they could more easily collect information. This very lack of protection later made it easier for Snowden to download their files, what is estimated at over 1 million documents, maybe more. Only Snowden knows for sure.
The NSA was engaged in things like dumbing down encryption. Making sure that encryption wasn't as strong as it could be so they could break it. And then they complain that there's a cybersecurity issue out there. Well, of course there's a cybersecurity issue because they've created a cybersecurity issue, building back doors into all these software programs.
The government was soon cracking down. Here's what happened to Thomas Drake after an article appeared exposing the NSA.
And as I found out later, then Vice President Cheney had simply issued the call, fine and fry the perpetrator, whoever, just fine and fry. I don't care who it is, make an object lesson of them.
Find and fry.
Find and fry. So it's 2005, they launched, the article comes out, they launch this massive leak investigation. I knew when the article came out, no doubt there would be investigation. When the investigation was launched, I'd get caught up in it. Why? Very few people knew about the secret surveillance programs. They had really...
So what happens to you one morning at your house?
Well, it's now almost 2 years later, and I'm getting ready to go to work. It's November 28th. It's shortly after 7 a.m. I look out the window and I see all these FBI agents streaming across the front yard. And of course, my heart's in my throat, and the nightmare had begun. And I was facing 35 years in prison. 5 counts for espionage, 1 for obstruction of justice, 4 for making false statements to FBI agents. And now my name is splashed all over mainstream media and the alternative media.
Guilty?
Guilty in the court of public opinion at that time because it was so rare for an American to be charged with espionage.
In the end, Drake was allowed to plead to a minor infraction and the charges were dropped. Russ Tice, who also challenged surveillance, was under surveillance.
I have the FBI follow me around. At first it was the black sedans, and then I got to a point almost where it's like every black sedan I saw, I thought that's probably an FBI guy, and you got to get it. I realized I had to get out of that mentality too, because they're there, but not everybody out there is one of them. So, and I learned how to spot them. And now the shining knight in armor is Ed Snowden, because what he was willing to do, the rest of us were not. Was he was willing to fall on his own sword to do it, and we were not. Mainly with the documentation that he's provided, because he's provided the proof. Their documentation he's provided, which proves all the rest of us to be correct. And they cannot refute it now. They cannot.
So that took a lot of guts. And he was asked, what do you think is going to happen to you? And he said NG, standing for not good. He seems to be aware of the dangerous position he's in.
Well, yeah, especially if he looked at what happened to Mr. Drake, and anytime you put documents out there, and I find this interesting because I've been on TV shows from way back, and they look at me and they say, "Oh yeah, you can say that, but where's your proof? Where's your proof?" I said, okay, if I were to pull out the documentation right now, and it had a bunch of classification lines on it, and I could prove it with the documentation right here at this table, do you think that I'd make it out of this building without being shackled?
Motivated employees join institutions because they believe in their mission, but often when exposed to abuses, they turn on their agencies and become insider threats. how do they keep all these people in intelligence in line? We asked intelligence analyst Brad Summerall, who, like Ed Snowden, was an online network administrator, but in the military cleared for top-secret information. What did he think drove Snowden to rebel?
Something got to him, you know. He was working in the NSA office where he also saw a lot of those things happen. Just like in the Marine Corps, you end up in the field out in, the field where you see other things happen. Some things get to you, some things don't, I'd imagine he had seen enough material that for whatever reason he felt he was upon himself that he was going to do what he was going to do.
To share it with the American people in some way
Yeah, and jump ship at the same time.
Yeah. But I guess it was a challenging and kind of gutsy or crazy thing to do.
Yeah, definitely.
But when people are on the inside, a lot of the people who are actually doing the technical jobs don't necessarily believe in the mission in terms of, that what they're doing is really protecting the American people sometimes. They feel like they begin to question it, let's say.
Well, I think it's sometimes, depending on what situation you're in, you might begin to question yourself. Everybody found it a little bit curious that he did it with his position. He was taken care of very well. There was a lot of other people working for the government that didn't get making nearly that and would have certainly never have done it at the same time. I just think he felt he was removed in some way. That's about the only thing that I can imagine. Just a disconnect.
Right now they have going on what they call the Insider Threat Program, where they're terrified. 4,000 people on the list of potential insider threats. Seems to be a lot of paranoia in that world too.
Yeah, a lot. A lot of big checks were written in 2002.
Big checks?
Meaning money. You gave a lot of people a lot of jobs, and when you give somebody a job to do, they're going to do their job. They overstaffed a lot, over technology, over everything. So you just got all this big money thrown in one direction, and everybody has to justify their cost.
Has all this money resulted in enhanced security? You would think so, but the former director of NSA, General Alexander, says that the U.S. is more at risk today than ever, perhaps because they overexpanded with inexperienced and overpaid people. He told an Australian newspaper, quote, "We're at greater risk. I can't measure it. You can't say, well, is that enough to get through? I don't know." If he doesn't know, who does? His solution, more spying. With so many people on the payroll, it's hard to control everyone. Staff members are not encouraged to think independently. The NSA has to keep track of them as well as the people they are spying on. Compounding the problem, NSA has outsourced, in effect privatized, so many of its programs, reports James Bamford, who writes about NSA. Quote, "The Snowden case demonstrates the potential risks involved when a nation turns its spying and eavesdropping over to companies with lax security and inadequate personnel policies." In any other country, the spying issue would be relegated to politics and the law. But in America, it has been embraced by popular culture, turning Snowden into a celebrity with his face on buses, comic books, and now action figures. Already, there are 2 Hollywood movies planned about his escapades. More ominous than the risks whistleblowers face are what's happened to the many victims of covert U.S. foreign policies, whose fate has often been buried in secret documents that no one ever sees. That's why this National Security Archive exists, a not-for-profit library of formerly secret documents that details the hidden history of U.S. covert policy. Archive Director Tom Blanton showed us around their facility at George Washington University, just a few miles from the offices of the officials who initially kept these documents from being seen. We sat down in a room packed with boxes of formerly secret files.
We've been doing this for almost 30 years, and these are the documents that are still in paper form. Now, almost everything we get, we get it digitally or we convert it to digital as soon as it comes in the door.
So this is the real underlying documentation of scandals that most Americans don't even remember.
Well, every few years, the the meteor hits the Yucatan, or a window pops open of scandal, and then people go, wow, really? That's what you see back there? That's what's happening right now with Edward Snowden. It's sort of like the curtain came up and we go, really? Is that what's going on back there?
Snowden's courage in releasing these documents has introduced maybe a whole new generation, perhaps through the mass media, the American people, once again, to what their government is doing in their name.
I think the real impact of those Snowden revelations was to show a series of lies by the government. I mean, if you went through the Church Committee investigations or Iran-Contra, you're used to the fact that the government can routinely lie. But I think on this surveillance stuff, to have the head of national intelligence look into the camera and say, no, sir, we're not collecting data on millions of Americans. 2 months later, it turns out he's lying through his teeth.
If the American people really knew and understood what was going on, they wouldn't support it.
That's an open question, because the main thing the American people seemed not to support of all this surveillance was just the hoovering up of all the phone calls, the big metadata collection system where every phone call for the last 5 to 8 years sits to, from, date, time, length, sits in a set of computers out at Fort Meade, Maryland. The other parts of the surveillance state, though, it seems like the American people do support or would support if it's targeted directly at keeping them safe. And I think that was the objection to the phone call program that Snowden revealed, because not only was it scooping up everything, it had no connection at all to really fighting terrorism.
You know, at the same time, we've lived in a society, and incidents like 9/11, of course, have contributed to this, that's very fearful, that's kept on the edge of, paranoia. There's always an enemy out there that's after us, that's coming after us. And many Americans are, because of that, willing to justify or finance or support efforts that actually undercut their own freedom.
Well, I think Americans got to keep asking the question, are we safer in the dark? And about these surveillance programs, we were not safer in the dark. In fact, we weren't being protected from terrorism, and the government was rapidly expanding its power and collecting everything it could.
We were also shown documents the archive now has online. They received tens of thousands of requests from researchers and the public for documents and reports. They have had up to 3 million independent views.
So we've been collecting all the documents published by anybody from the Edward Snowden leaks. So the Washington Post, Guardian, everybody, Glenn Greenwald, all the folks publishing, putting them together with the historical documents about the wiretap controversies, about the previous debates, and then publishing them. So we've done the first collection. This is about...
We can now add the National Security Archive to the other insider threats the government faces. As investigative reporters, they were once outsiders, but now they have moved inside a prestigious university to ensure that the revelations of whistleblowers become a legitimate part of history and not so easy to whitewash or forget. Today in America, nearly 5 million people have security clearances. Nearly 1 million have access to top-secret documents. It's a big industry that seems to be getting bigger every day, and yet parts of that industry are pushing back.
They're already pressing the government to disclose way more about how many times the government asks them for data, how much data they have to give over, what are the restrictions on them. We know a ton more about those transactions today after Snowden, not because Snowden leaked them, but because the companies are pushing back against the government.
The insider threat is not new or likely to disappear. Edward Snowden was not the first, nor will he be the last. And there's more to come from the documents Snowden made off with, including the names of people NSA has spied on. Even as some establishment journalists turn on Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden, former whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg, the one-time Vietnam military officer who leaked the Pentagon Papers, rush to their defense.
Well, I think he did a great benefit to this country by letting us know what the National Security Agency, the NSA, is doing for the president under both administrations, namely intervening in the privacy of every communication of every American who has an electronic device. It's very hard to imagine a democracy really surviving long with the government having that kind of ability to blackmail any given person.
Ellsberg also embraced the case of military whistleblower Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, who released secret documents and this video on alleged war crimes in Iraq.
Come on, fire.
It's a credit to human beings, as a matter of fact, for being concerned not only about American lives and American security, but about what we were doing to foreigners, to Iraqis.
Now Ellsberg and other whistleblowers have joined hands to encourage more whistleblowing through a website called exposefacts.org that can securely receive anonymous leaks, precisely what the government fears could lead to even more insider threats. That's one look into the future. Coming up next, we will have other forecasts, including Edward Snowden's in the final episode of our documentary series, America's Surveillance State. Welcome to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, one seat of world power. Rest assured, all of the people out here are under constant video monitoring somewhere. You know, it's sunny, it's hot here outside the White House, but it's hard to get people to tell you how they feel about the spying that's going on. Some may be afraid to speak. Others say, I can't tell you anything because I'm on vacation, so I can't think about it while I'm on vacation. Others were much more clear about their opposition to NSA spying.
It's illegal. We have rights to privacy, whether it be in public or on our computers or on our phones. The government doesn't have any right to spy on us. It needs to stop.
And yet they're doing it big time, aren't they?
Yep.
So
you can't drive through a traffic light without having 10 cameras watching you. I mean, do we not have some right to privacy, even in public? I think we do. I think our government's gone way left and way socialist.
I don't feel good about this. You know, there's a joke now that says the chancellor changed just her number of telephone. No, but without joke, it is not a good thing. One should know who are your friends, and one should know who are not your friends.
We're trying to get some people's reaction to the scandal about the NSA spying on people, if you're worried about it, concerned about it.
Well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you should have nothing to hide.
Do I mind if they listen in on my conversations? Not a bit, because I don't have anything to hide.
Do you know that statement, you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide? The very statement, you have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide, was a statement directly attributed to Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda.
The reality of America's surveillance state cannot be denied. It is very real and to critics very dangerous for the future of democracy. Not only are there protests uniting right and left, but satirists like the creators of Australia's Juice News deploy a rap attack on the surveillance state.
Behold the latest weapon in the war of terror, our greatest invention since 9/11, guaranteed to keep us free and safe forever. I give you the surveillance state, ladies and generals. Our secret wires log your keys dial, monitor every single number on your speed dial, rewind straight to your position with facial recognition and pinpoint you within 0.03 of a mile.
While some citizens fight back against more encroachments on privacy, the NSA and its backers in the White House, Congress, and the courts are expanding their own reach, now monitoring literally trillions of messages and even using state-of-the-art facial recognition software. NSA is also building facilities to store its data, like this top-secret $1.7 billion storage center in Utah, the size of 17 football fields. It will store yottabytes, the equivalent of 500 quintillion pages of text. The war on terror seems almost self-perpetuating, along with its insatiable need for endless surveillance, even as the surveillance state is being challenged as never before. There is a political battle over the future of NSA spying, with tactics escalating on all sides. In fact, mass U.S. surveillance goes back to our war on the Philippines in 1901, when it was used to identify critics and rebels. It had a strong racial component then, and critics say it still does, especially in spying on the Muslim community, even as that seems to have abated somewhat.
The surveillance program was created 18 months after the 9/11 terror attacks. Its mission to have undercover police officers collect information about Muslim and Middle Eastern communities, eavesdropping on mosques, businesses, and restaurants. While supporters argued it was a necessary anti-terror strategy, the program, created under the watch of former Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, outraged many Muslims who believed it was a violation of civil rights.
What can stop the surveillance state? What about the courts? Adam Liptak covers the Supreme Court for the New York Times.
The press had some great victories in the 60s and 70s, and that's basically in decline. And after 9/11, and with concerns about national security, the landscape for press freedom is not great, the legal landscape.
So what can journalists do here? If they're trying to get information legitimately, the government doesn't want them to have it. That's a confrontation or a challenge. What do they do?
Well, journalists can be tough and be brave and seek out information and publish it, and unfortunately sometimes face the consequences.
Liptak speaks in terms of a balance between safeguards the government says it needs and the public's right to know. He admits his newspaper doesn't publish everything they know.
There is, on the one hand, vast overclassification, sometimes to cover up government misdeeds or embarrassing episodes. On the other hand, there are the kinds of secrets that could really endanger the nation, and finding the right line is not an easy thing.
But I mean, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers. The New York Times is publishing, quote, the Snowden Papers. Does that make you proud, or do you have concerns about that?
I'm not going to second guess the judgment of the very good editors at the New York Times, but they are judgments, and we don't publish everything that comes into our possession.
The press clearly feels constrained and so has embraced whistleblowers like Edward Snowden. Before Snowden sent NSA documents to reporters, he insisted they encrypt their emails to avoid being spied on, and he even made this video to show them how to do it.
Okay, installation's completed. Let's start the program. You have two choices, Cleopatra or GPA for the new privacy assistant. You want GPA. It's better in almost every way, even though it's older. This is the interface, your keys. First thing you need to do as a new user is go to Preferences and click Advanced Mode. If you don't click this, and it's not enabled by default, you won't be able to choose your key length. You want a key that is stronger than the default length.
Andy Greenberg of Wired magazine says more and more reporters are encrypting for fear they're being spied on.
I think that's often lost as we discuss the NSA's really incredible surveillance abilities is that they're not unlimited. There are ways to evade the NSA surveillance. As Snowden himself said, crypto works. Encryption software can prevent the government, the NSA, from spying on your communications. And so I think that that's created this new renaissance in encryption tools and anonymity programs that can actually mask or hide or create a kind of bubble of privacy around your activities online. That still exists even in today's world of massive surveillance.
Crypto may have helped, but it was Snowden's bold acts that captured media attention. He was at the time only 29, a high school dropout, ending up in a $122,000 a year job. He called himself Virex, Latin for truth teller, after using the code name True Hoo-Ha. It said he spent 8 months plundering NSA secret files. The mass media is now all over the story. A survey of the LexisNexis database found NSA was mentioned only 675 times in all U.S. media in 2012. That number skyrocketed to 6,955 mentions in 2013. Earlier, media critics denounced the lack of NSA investigations by the press before Snowden's disclosures, and then meager media pickup of them afterwards. Today, there's been a renaissance of independent investigative reporting. Journalists close to Snowden like Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras launched their own publication, The Intercept, to expose government spying. It is funded by internet billionaire Pierre Omidyar.
We'll give our journalists everything they need to do their jobs well. The freedom to travel, legal protection when they need it, new and innovative technology, and the rarest resource of all, the time and organizational backing to develop their skills.
Omidyar is only one business leader now pushing publicly for restraints on NSA spying.
Simple example is the National Security Agency allegedly collected the phone records of every phone call of 320 million people in order to identify roughly 300 people who might be at risk. That's just bad public policy.
At the same time, civil liberties groups on the left and libertarians on the right have been pushing Congress to act because many, like the ACLU's Ben Weisner, see congressional oversight as a joke.
I think fundamentally our concern is that surveillance technologies have developed so quickly and democratic controls have been much too slow. So that's true basically in our laws that protect our privacy from surveillance, but it's also true in our oversight. I think that what we learned from the Snowden revelations is that those parts of our democracy that are supposed to do oversight over the executive branch have failed miserably. That the Congress, that the intelligence committees that are supposed to rein in and oversee the surveillance state, in fact do the opposite. They enable it in secret.
Mr. Snowden hasn't lied to anyone. He did break his oath of office, but part of his oath of office is to the Constitution. And he believes that when James Clapper came in March, our National Director of Intelligence came and lied, that he was simply coming forward and telling the truth, that your government was lying. And this is a big concern of mine because it makes me doubt the administration and their word to us when they come and talk to us, because they have now admitted that they will lie to us if they think it's in the name of national security.
Proposed new bills would make some necessary changes to a handful of surveillance laws, but not significantly narrow the NSA's powers granted by law and presidential directives.
You know, the NSA has information now on every federal judge, on every member of Congress, on every other member of the executive branch. They may say it's just metadata, but this is the kind of information that could destroy any individual if it were put to the wrong kind of use. So I think people have reason to be worried, you know, not that our form of government is going to change overnight, but that if we don't put in the right controls, there are real threats to our way of life.
While government spying is what's being debated now, private spying is also threatening.
There are private companies gathering information about the political and protest activities of Americans on the streets of American neighborhoods across the country, and there's virtually no regulation of that activity.
There's also a private surveillance industry, isn't there?
Exactly.
I mean, with their own technologies and, you know, and in many cases you have international players like Israeli companies that are very active.
Right, and you have an infrastructure built for it. So after 9/11, the U.S. government helped fund the creation of what are called state and local intelligence fusion centers. And these fusion centers incorporate state and local law enforcement with federal law enforcement, often other state and local government entities like fire and emergency response, sometimes even utilities, private companies, and the military, all together collecting information that's collected by the local police in your neighborhood as a way to funnel it up to the intelligence community. And then they have programs like what they call the Suspicious Activity Reporting Program, which sounds fine if something's suspicious, but they define what's suspicious, and they say things like videotaping, photography, note-taking, drawing diagrams, in one case, in one program, espousing extreme views.
If you see something
say something. Isn't that the big slogan here in New York?
Exactly. And what we've seen, only a relatively small number of these suspicious activity reports have been made public. But what we see is exactly what we warned they would be, that it's a proxy for racial profiling, because what's being reported isn't suspicious.
Former FBI agent Mike German doesn't dismiss fears of a police state, because he too knows from the Snowden documents that NSA shares intelligence on Americans with the FBI, a domestic law enforcement agency.
Because of my political websites, I was visited by the FBI, the United States Marshals, the Secret Service, the Department of Homeland Security, the United States Air Force, and some other people that I don't even know. And not always, sometimes they just approached me and wanted to know, content about my websites, what certain things meant.
Even if government surveillance is somehow restrained or curtailed, private surveillance is growing, with new spy technologies now widely available in the consumer market.
This is your family.
Here's an ad from one company that sells surveillance in the name of personal security.
And when you're not in the office, do you know what employees are doing? Does it feel like you're losing control? Introducing mSpy. mSpy is a highly advanced smartphone monitoring software that has been designed to help you mitigate risks at home or at work. Protect your kids and your loved ones from online and offline dangers. Track their location or restrict access to applications and websites. Check their SMS and phone calls. mSpy lets you prevent risks of data leaks, monitor your employees, and keep track of their productivity in and out of the office.
Surveillance is widespread in the corporate sector, with companies spying on customers, employees, and rivals. Sam Antar worked for an electronics chain known as Crazy Eddie, which was shut down by the federal government for corrupt practices. They were using surveillance gadgets as if they were their own NSA.
My name is Sam Antar. I'm the former chief financial officer of a criminal enterprise known as Crazy Eddies. I'm a former CPA and I am a convicted felon. Today I advise law enforcement, colleges, universities about white-collar crime.
Sam, the issue of surveillance has become a big issue, but it's not a new issue, really. What have been your experiences with the surveillance state that we live in?
Back in my criminal days, let's put it this way, in every organization, whether it's a legitimate organization or a criminal organization, there are rivals vying for power. There are factions in every organization. In our criminal enterprise, which was Crazy Eddie's, my cousin Eddie used an Israeli security company to keep tabs on his rivals within the co-conspiracy.
So everyone
in other words, there was no honor among thieves.
Everyone was spying on everyone else.
Yes.
And this private surveillance, in a way, has been going on for a long time and is very pervasive. It's a big business.
Yes. It's a bigger story than the NSA story. It's really corporate surveillance of critics or corporate surveillance of rivals within their own corporations. In other words, executives surveilling rival executives.
Perhaps that's why in our age of innovation, some engineers and tech geeks are designing a new NSA surveillance-free internet. Physicists are using quantum physics to design one. Political leaders who've been spied on by the NSA, like leaders of Brazil and Germany, are encouraging this effort.
Brazil believes that the governing of the internet should be multi-sector, democratic and transparent. We consider the multilateral model to be the best way to govern it.
My belief is when you're in a difficult situation, avoid the problem, because sometimes you can't win every battle. And my belief is let's try and put our resources as corporations in the emerging sectors of the economies of the world where we're helping people with their needs and we're avoiding being part of a spy network that no matter how well-intentioned by some individual people will end up in very mischievous uses. And we see this all over repeatedly in history. So when you can't win, run to a new corner and try and build something new.
The new quantum computers may not be a panacea for privacy, says tech specialist and former military network administrator Brad Summerall.
No, they got quantum computers coming out, and quantum computers are going to change everything.
because then processing data is instantaneous, and any amount.
So this new technology that's coming down the pike is going to make surveillance and all of the things we're talking about now even worse, possibly.
Yep, a lot worse, a whole lot worse.
Do you feel that sometimes the system, just goes off on its own? It's almost rogue. You can't control it?
That's kind of what's going on now, especially with that Patriot Act still in effect. A lot of people have to understand that's what's doing the damage, is that Patriot Act.
It is new. I mean, look, money is the driver here. They've got money to do everything they want. If they want to snoop on their own people, they got money to do that. Congress is happy to appropriate money to places like NSA. But the stifling effect, now I ask you, what college graduate or PhD is going to want to come down to Washington and to subject him or herself to this kind of Stasi type environment? I suggest to you that they're going to get a bunch of people that I'd rather not see in the high positions of our security services.
Philosophically, do we become the people that we warned others about, like the Stasi of East Germany or the KGB, or have we turned into a surveillance state?
Well, we have, but there's some good news, okay? The good news is this, that surveillance states can't operate without incredibly gifted, incredibly imaginative, incredibly smart people like Edward Snowden, okay? Now, if you only have 1 out of 100, or maybe even out of 1,000, technically proficient people like this, that's all you need to do what Edward Snowden did. So, the governments cannot operate without these very bright people. A lot of these bright people bring consciences to their expertise. As long as that's the case, and that will continue to be the case, the governments will not be able to get away with this kind of thing. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is they'll keep trying. And as I said before, with the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches of our government all kind of complicit in this, well, and then you have the media and the corporations and all that, it looks very much like the classic definition that Mussolini gave to fascism.
And, there's still a lot more to be discovered. I mean, because of Edward Snowden, we have access to an awful lot of information about an awful lot of programs, but it's not nearly the scope of all these programs. Plus, you have so many different agencies involved now. I think there are 16 different agencies that make up the intelligence community, much less the multitude, the thousands of companies that are involved in this activity, both here in the U.S. and abroad.
Not quite everywhere. In a report, Top Secret America, the Washington Post showed that there are 854,000 contractors with top secret clearances. Since 9/11, 33 new facilities were built or are being built. That's 17 million square feet. The bottom line seems to be that everyone is in the game as a very profitable surveillance industry expands beyond the limits of government and beyond the borders of countries.
It's not a left-wing issue. It's not a right-wing issue per se. It goes on everywhere in this world. People want to know about what they don't know about.
And spy agencies play to that.
Yes.
NSA whistleblowers are hoping the public will get more engaged.
What lessons can we learn from this whole sad saga, if you will, of an agency that seems to have gone rogue but has gotten more money and more legitimacy as it goes along? What's in the future for America if this continues at this level?
A police state. That's what we're talking about. Right now, I think we're at the very beginnings of what I call police state light, because the police state tries to hide what they're doing. They're very covert about their police state activities. And they deny it, and they're lying about the fact that they do content.
What right do we have as a country to engage in mass surveillance of other nation states? We don't. Remember, the sovereign rights that are granted all human beings extends beyond just the fact that you're an American citizen. That's all human beings. There's American exceptionalism. Somehow we're immune from history. I don't think so. All empires have ended up in the dustbin of history. But see, all empires, when they realize that they or subconsciously realize they could end up in the dustbins of history, tend to project, they tend to compensate. And guess what they do? They increasingly militarize themselves. And that's precisely what is happening in this country.
Let's give the last word to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, whose daring disclosures have forced us all to reflect on the dangers of a total surveillance society and turned the American surveillance state into a political battleground.
To conclude, I'd like to remind you that even if these state surveillance programs were perfect, even if they were never abused, and even if the oversight failures that are all too common today were fixed, these programs have never been shown to be uniquely valuable in keeping us safe. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. 2 independent White House panels with complete access to classified information found that these programs had never stopped a single imminent terrorist attack in the United States. So I would argue, I would submit to you that when all 3 branches of government agree that these programs must end, it seems clear to me that they're not a legitimate defense of our freedoms, but they are in fact a clear and present danger to both them and our way of life as Americans.
America's Surveillance State was produced by Danny Schechter of Global Vision for Press TV.